Welcome to At the Wheel. We are where we talk about everything and everything that moves along with the technology and the materials that enable it. What we talk about on this show, as this is a disclaimer part, are just our opinions, should not be used as any kind of investment advice. My name is Joe White. I was the former Detroit bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal and for Reuters. I'm currently the author of the High Speed Rodeo Substack. At the top of your screen is my partner in crime, Tu Lee, the founder and current head of the management consultancy Sino Auto Insights, also an author on Substack. Look him up. And over in the corner next to me on the screen is our special guest today, Nick Carey, correspondent with Reuters. Nick and I worked together for many years at Reuters in Detroit, and also when Nick was in Chicago. And today we're going to talk mainly about an article, a special report that Nick co-wrote with my former colleague Nora Shirozu on Reuters, Reuters.com. The title of the article is How China's New Auto Giants Left GM, VW, and Tesla in the Dust. And Nick went to China and did a lot of reporting on how BYD and Chery and other Chinese automakers are really revving it up. Nick, welcome. And let's start off by you went to China this spring or early summer for the Shanghai Auto Show, and you hadn't been there for almost 30 years. What was that like? That contrast.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, guys. It's a pleasure to be here. It was mind blowing getting back to China. It's completely unrecognized, particularly because I started off going to Shenzhen to see BYD.
Well, hold on. You started by breaking bread with me in Shanghai right before the show started.
You broke bread. I'd already hung out in Shenzhen before I came.
That's right.
And but I'd gone through Shenzhen in 1997 on a trip into China, and it wasn't a fishing village by that point, but it was a town, and now I can't remember, it's 8 or 10 million people. So there were no tangible landmarks that I could hold on to. And everywhere I went in China, I was just gobsmacked by the monumental scale of so much of the architecture. You take sort of the train station in Hefei when I went to visit a NIO's factory out there. It's a city of about 8 million people, but I've never seen from the outside a bigger train station. It just, it's mind blowing how big everything is.
Yeah. Let's dive into what you and Nori reported in that special report, because I think you both did a great job of taking sort of bits and pieces that a lot of people, including the two of us, Tu and myself, have kind of thrown out there, and really pulled it together as to kind of what it is that the best of the Chinese automakers are doing. Maybe let's start with this anecdote that's in the top of the story about Chery and how they managed to redesign the suspension of a car that they were trying to sell in Europe, and not to great success. And talk about that, and talk about what was really important about that episode.
Right. Well, this was what started the whole story, because Chery invited me over to their R&D center in Frankfurt, saying, "Look, we want to show you the Emoda 5, which is a vehicle that they launched last year. So they wanted to give me a test drive. I didn't realize exactly what I was going to see, but they had me drive two vehicles. One was the original Emoda 5 that was not sold in Europe, but was the version that HQ and Woohoo had sent them, homologated for Europe, perfectly road legal for Europe. But they had me test drive that, and it felt like driving a boat. Very squishy brakes. The steering wasn't very crisp. And we went out on the autobahn where there's to a section where there's no speed limit. So went up to about 180 kilometers an hour, and it was all over the place. It didn't feel good. And then they said, okay, now we're going to have you test drive the version that we're actually selling in Europe. And it felt like any other mainstream SUV crossover that you'd drive in Europe today. And basically, when they got the phase 1, they called it, they sent over this guy who's a former Maserati executive who's now working for Chery. And they went to these proving grounds about 6 hours drive from Chery's headquarters, and called in all the suppliers. And Chery, like BYD, either owns some of its suppliers directly or has JVs in them, and so can call them up and say on a Saturday morning, you need to get to this proving ground 6 hours from now. And they either showed up the same day or next morning, and then they went through a list. And these were all homologated parts that this guy at Maserati said, or the parts that had already been validated by Chery. So he went down through the shopping list to say, we need a new steering system. That came from Bosch. They needed new dampers, a new ESP, new brakes, new tires, and they signed off on it in a weekend.
Can I stop you there for a second,
Yeah.
Nick, and give our audience a little bit of background, at least in North American automotive space? For new parts, they not only need to be prototyped traditionally, they need to be prototyped and then tested, validated, and then they need to come up with production tooling. And that entire process is called the PPAP process, the production part approval process. That doesn't happen fast. It happens really, really slowly at the traditional automakers. And so it sounds like the Chinese automakers aren't bypassing the approval process or the validation process. They're just digitizing some of it and skipping parts that they feel are unnecessary or parts of the process. So please continue, Nick.
Yeah. Well, in this case, one of the strengths of the Chinese is that they tend to do off the shelf parts, so things that are validated for one vehicle, they know they can use for others. So in this case, this former Maserati executive had a list of things that he knew that Chery had already validated, had already been through that process, but Chery signed off on it and the suppliers signed off on it in a weekend, which, this guy said, you tried that with European suppliers, you might get a meeting in a couple of weeks, and the whole process would take 18 months. But 6 weeks after they had this meeting at these proving grounds, Chery started shipping the vehicles to Europe to meet your European comfort demands, because people don't want a car that doesn't handle well in Europe. And the difference between sort of a Chinese spec, the European spec, I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that most Chinese car buyers are by definition first-time buyers, so they just don't have the same expectations. And the Motor 5 is doing well. I think if they'd tried to sell the Chinese version, I think we'd be in a very different situation.
Now,
And
is this a hybrid or an electric car? Just quick.
This was a petrol model, because unlike BYD, Chery's decision was to come to Europe with a mixture of EVs, gas models, and hybrids to cover more of the waterfront, as it were, with sales, because parts of Europe, even like Italy, Greece, Spain, EVs are a tiny proportion of overall sales.
So for them, it's a good strategy because they're doing that in a lot of different countries.
Yeah.
The one thing that I want to emphasize, Nick, is that these Chinese consumers, not only are a good portion of them first-time buyers, but you're not going to be able to stretch your legs at 180 kilometers an hour on most roads in China. So there's practical use cases that only Europe has.
Yes.
So I think that's also a big difference between why there needs to be a China spec versus a Euro spec.
Well, also
Yeah.
and speed, because the government is watching, and so to even test a vehicle at that speed, the Chery in Chery's case, they rely on the folks in Frankfurt to test vehicles at high speed, because it's just not something you have to do in China.
So you also did you also visit BYD or looked at BYD? Yeah, talk about BYD. Talk about what you saw at BYD. And yeah, talk about what you saw at BYD.
Well, at BYD, it was mostly most of what we got about BYD was either on background from suppliers or other OEMs or other automakers, or from investors. BYD was not immensely talkative, but what we did get to see at headquarters in Shenzhen in particular was some of the new vehicles, like the interesting brand name Yang Wang. So we got to test drive the U8, which can turn on a dime and can float, and the U9, which dances and jumps. And so we got to put that through its paces, and then go and see some of their crash testing and other things. But for the most part, BYD is not immensely media facing. So a lot of what we got was sort of talking to joint venture partners or to others who have worked closely with BYD.
Did they have this too? Go ahead.
Really quickly, so BYD now has 4 brands under its footprint. BYD brand, which is the mass market brand. They have Denza, which was formerly 10% owned or 9% owned by Mercedes, that they've taken on, which is kind of their mid-range brand. Then they have Fangchengbao, and then Yangwang is their premium brand, which is a million RMB or $150,000 vehicles. The U8 is an SUV. It's about the size of a Range Rover, I would say, Nick. And then the U9 is a 2-door sports car. And so they're struggling a little bit on selling the other brands. BYD is still going really strong, but please continue.
Yeah, well, the thing that really struck me with the Yang ones, particularly with the U9, was just, to make an electric sports car. It's at the moment it looks more like a display of what they're capable of doing. Particularly, a car that can jump and dance, as well as, because this has been the challenge for European sports car makers, is making an electric sports car that is going to appeal to people. And I think that if this is what they're capable of, at some point in time, my personal view is that Ferrari need to be looking over their shoulder, because eventually, if you got young people, especially young people in China with the means, they might not be that interested in a combustion engine car, but might want one that dances and jumps.
Well, the one observation I'll make, and then I have a question, Nick, for you about, is that, Yanglong doesn't really translate to a Western ear as a brand, but it's not like there might be some Western brands for sale, Maserati, frankly, being one, right? There's certainly talk about that Stellantis may unload Maserati. So, brands can be bought, better brands can be created if the technology's there. As you say, I mean, this may be kind of their version of the old Dodge Viper, just kind of a halo car. But let me ask you something about BYD, because from reading the piece, it seemed like BYD, maybe even more so than Chery, is operating at kind of warp speed when it comes to refreshing and redesigning product. But you and Nori made a point that BYD has 900,000 workers, which is, it's basically the same as VW and Toyota combined. And if you're kind of applying your lean production brain to this, as I would, because that's kind of my background, you'd say, well, wow, these people, this company is not efficient at all. This is just a matter of throwing armies at problems. Talk about that. I mean, what's your take on that from the people you talk with about, whether this is efficiency or whether this is just, kind of overwhelming a problem with huge numbers of people?
Well, I think it's a little bit of that, but they're in expansion mode. So I think that they've been adding a lot of people because I think they're very bullish on their future. But also, I think in China, they went on a massive hiring spree last fall, where they hired, it was August to October, they hired 200,000 people and graduates, and this coincided with an edict from the Chinese government saying, we want companies to hire more graduate students. Whether or not that's efficient is, remains to be seen, whether, how that translates into margins for them, or, whether it weakens their margins. It remains to be seen. But it's, I think it's a combination of business and politics in a way that only China can manage.
And let's frame this in a way, because in your article, Nick, you and Nori had noted that in 2020, they were at 400,000 vehicle sales. And last year, they're at 4.27 million. Emphasis on growth mode, as you had mentioned, but also they're in over 100 countries now. So the pendulum always swings, in my opinion, that you kind of overhire, but I think they're also not afraid to cut folks pretty easily, pretty quickly. And the younger graduates are those people that don't have a ton of seniority, because once you have seniority in China, there are protections and buyouts that you need required by the Chinese government. So I think there's a method to some of that madness.
Right. And then also, I was, you asked me so earlier about my impressions of China. One of the things that really struck me was visiting BYD, but also going to this Neo factory in Hefei, and also a Zeekr factory in Ningbo, is just how young everyone is. They're really, really young workforce, and I think that it's Joe. You've spent a lot of time at factories with UAW workers, as have I, and they look like you and me, or like you. They're about our age. Whereas the factories I went to in China, everyone is in their 20s. So I think that they work people really hard, and young people are capable of really hard work, because I think this is one of the other things that the Chinese have excelled at in speeding up their development technique, is that they work people 6 days a week, 12 hours a day.
Yeah, no, and that comes through, and that's not just in the auto sector, obviously, but yes, it does seem that back to the kind of the point about the number of people BYD has. They have 900,000 people, and they're working them 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, and yeah, that's definitely an issue. And they also have a younger customer too that maybe has a different kind of take on what's acceptable. Actually, I want to and I want to throw this into get you into this too, because I know you've written about this. But the Chinese automakers, part of the speed that they're able to achieve is that they have a different take on what's important for quality. You quoted someone, and I can't remember from which company, talking about we don't need excessive quality, quote unquote. Talk about that, and talk about sort of the different view of what makes an acceptable product. That seems to be a big key part of how they're able to turn things around so quickly.
Right. Well, something that there was one of the executives that we talked to at Chery, who spent his first 20 years of his career at JLR, a Jaguar Land Rover. He said, look, they have a manual of about, well, at least when he left, they had a manual of 10,000 pages and counting of all the things you had to test in sequence to get a car made. And an awful lot of what the Chinese have done is digitalize a lot of the process and not going for physically testing basic parts because they think that's excessive. So when I visited Zeekr's R&D center in Gothenburg, they use a system called hardware in the loop. This is a massive computer that takes up about 2 rooms, and what they do is they plug physical parts into it and they run digital simulations. So if it's an indicator signal for a car, they can run digital scenarios for a signal in about 30 minutes. And more extensive parts they can run in a few days. You can run through millions of scenarios, and then when it comes to because what a lot of what they're doing is not making many prototypes. They'll tend to they'll either make one prototype on Neo. I can come back to Neo because they don't even make a full prototype. They do mules. But for Zeekr, they have one of these physical simulators in the basement in Gothenburg, shaped like a car, big digital screen. They got a guy who's trained to put the car through its tests, because anything that's safety related where they think, well, you know what, the digital simulations on their own might not work. We need a human driver to see how the technology responds to a human. They do that, and that cuts down their time dramatically because they think that the amount of testing that Western OEMs do is excessive. We had a guy quoted in there actually from that visit to Zeekr who used to do software as a supplier for the Volkswagen Group. And he talked about a specific case, that in Volkswagen's case, he said that Volkswagen, at least until recently, treated any software change like a screw, a physical attribute that if you changed it, you had to road test the car for 15,000 kilometers, so over 10,000 miles in any given market, any given region where it's going to be sold. And he gave us a very specific example of where he changed the color of the trees in Volkswagen software. And then they had, because the software was navigation software, and because the vehicle was going to be sold in North America, Europe, and China, they had to road test it for 75,000 kilometers.
Because the trees are a different color.
Because the trees are a different color. And this is just the mind, because look, the manual Jaguar Land Rover has been building up for decades. And, so has Volkswagen's approach to building a car. It was something that worked perfectly well for 100 years, where everyone does everything in sequence and everything has its place and everything's done in a particular way. And the Chinese haven't had to do that. So rather than having everyone do everything in sequence, all the teams work on things at the same time. So in Neo's case, they do a digital prototype every 90 days. So they start with a digital prototype after the first 90 days.
Also known as digital twin.
And then they discuss what needs to be changed. Next 90 days, road test the digital prototype. And then they get to a stage where anything that's a big change, like with, I can't remember which model that they launched this year, because there are so many numbers and letters, the car was drive-by-wire. And so rather than make an entire prototype, they retrofitted an existing car, so a mule, so that they could test it on the road. Because why waste time building an entire prototype for one aspect of the car? And I think that's really significant that they, that everyone working on things together. You don't have to wait your turn. And the same goes for Chery. They get to one level of prototyping, and then they make a bunch of them because they're cheap. Once you actually get to that stage, and they hand a prototype to everyone. And the suppliers, different departments. You said at Jaguar Land Rover, you'd end up, the last people to get a car would be the crash test people, because they'd crash it.
Yeah.
But with this, it's like everyone gets one at the same time, and it cuts out so many different corners of the development process that collectively add up to a couple of years.
So let me unpack a little bit of that, and then I've noticed that there are some folks that I know, some ex-automotive folks or current automotive folks on the live stream. So I'm sure I'm going to get a bunch of head nods when I start saying some of these things. But I was always taught early on, although it wasn't in practice a lot of places. I started at GM, as you both know. I'm old, in the late 90s. And one of the first all people meetings, they put up a slide because I worked in the purchasing and supply chain group. They were like, we have 60 gas caps. Why do we need 60 gas caps? And Nick, I'm saying that because it points back to the off the shelf. We have existing parts that work. These have already been approved. So understanding that we need to put them in new systems, we don't really need to validate this part because it's an existing part. So there's that part of it. And then, to your point, is the legacy automakers, and they drive a lot of it via the software. Okay. And part of the benefit of having young people is that they don't know potentially the quality and reliability of some of these Chinese vehicles and the processes that support them, but creating prototypes, creating a handful of alphas and betas and testing them physically, that's not helping warranty costs for the legacy automakers. So
Doesn't seem to be.
this is where it's a debate that needs to be had internally from the OEMs.
Right. Well, and to your point there with warranty costs, is so many of these vehicles are so new. We don't actually know yet what's going to happen further down the line with some of these vehicles. What we do know for now, though, is particularly when it comes to safety rate in Europe, the Chinese are almost all of them acing the Euro NCAP. Could the parts wear out faster? We'll have to see. We don't know yet. It's a debate that we'll be having in retrospect in a few years' time, I think. But to your point again, though, when it comes to having parts off the shelf, Zeekr showed me that they've built themselves an AI catalog of every vehicle, every part that Geely has ever made, so that if you're designing a new vehicle, the AI catalog can say, well, you want this kind of part. Well, this kind of part already exists, and so does this one, and this one costs a lot less. So, and is already in production, so we'd recommend that. So it's way, again, more ways to take stuff off the shelf, but also ways to take it off the shelf that will save money in the long run.
So you mentioned that at the beginning of our talk that Chery was designing a car to be sold in Europe, and I think you have a story out this morning about GAC entering the European market. I mean, you're in London. You're seeing the thing that we here in America cannot see, at least not yet. You're seeing what happens when Chinese brands enter an established, mature market up against, pretty well-known and to some extent well-respected brands. What's happening? How are the Chinese automakers doing? Where are they getting their market share from?
At the moment, the only real volume sellers so far, because we've got a lot coming. They mentioned GAC said this morning that they're coming. Geely brand is coming. Chery's going to launch its Chery brand because they already have the Omoda and JQ here, and Chang'an is coming as well. BYD are they're tapping into the EV market here. They're coming in at a slightly lower price point than a lot of their competitors. Because of course the Chinese in Europe are not selling cars cheaply because this is where they can make margin, because no one's making margin in China. So what they do is, I think they're taking a page out of the playbook of the Koreans and the Japanese, where they come in with a car that's fully spec'd, a couple of grand cheaper than any equivalent, so that people are getting a really good value for money. And the EVs that I've driven, the Chinese ones are great. I was at a test drive event a couple of weeks ago, and drove BYD, Emoda, Chang'an, Xpeng, and Leap Motor, and they're all great vehicles.
Joe, I know Nick to be fairly opinionated, so I believe that Nick and I would think you'd be pretty impressed once you get behind the wheel of some of these vehicles. I think you'd be like, wow.
Yeah, the Detroit will probably be the last place to get one unless I can borrow the I think it's the Xiaomi that Jim Farley has been driving around, driving his employees crazy.
Or if you want to take a trip down to Tijuana or something, we can get in a few
Yeah, we'll
cars
see
there.
about. But it's interesting, right? It's interesting that the Chinese. I mean, it sounds like the full force of the wave hasn't even hit Europe yet. It's just beginning. Yeah, is that a fair statement?
Yeah, it is fair, because I was going to say that if you look at Chery's example in the UK at the moment, they arrived 2 years after BYD. They only have two vehicles on sale: the Emoda 5 and the JQ7. The Emoda 5 only went on sale in August. It's available in gasoline version or full electric. The JQ7 is only available as a plug-in hybrid. I was looking, so year to date, so far, between those two vehicles, there are only a couple of thousand units behind BYD, that has 6 vehicles here and has been here for a lot longer, because Chery has come with a selection that is going to hit more of the waterfront. Electric is still pretty niche. 1 in 4 cars sold in the UK in June were fully electric, but it's still, you need cars on the road, and these are all volume players. So I think what we're going to see is BYD has recently, last few months, BYD has started selling hybrids as well. I think what we're going to see is the Chinese realize that they're not going to get very far just selling EVs in Europe. You need everything in order to be able to get the volume.
And I think it's important to separate the UK from Europe in a couple aspects. UK is right-hand drive. The digital twins allows them to test right-hand drive, left-hand drive a lot easier and homologate those vehicles, as opposed to legacy automakers would take a lot of time and consideration, because it was such a huge investment to homologate a right-hand drive versus a left-hand drive. And then do not sleep on Chery. Chery is doing well in Australia, another right-hand drive country. BYD, we expect them to book 5.5 million. That's fine. Everyone else asked me, who are the next level players? And Chery is, under their JQ brand, is doing really well. I was told, Nick, and you let me know if you have any friends that own them. The Omadas are really, really pretty good value. So it is, they're, I think, semi-expecting perhaps the UK to be a little bit friendlier than the rest of the EU, because there's still no tariff for the UK. But, the right-hand drive is something that some of the smaller players are going to try to avoid until they can enter more the Singapore, the Australias, the New Zealands. But the Cherys, which is a few million unit OEM, BYD obviously is a few million. So those larger players, they're not afraid to take on right-hand drive markets.
Yeah, and Europe, I think so far, other than the tariffs on EVs, which I think was, if you're going to do a tariff, I think it was a mistake to focus just on EVs, because the Chinese could just, it doesn't apply to hybrids, doesn't apply to gasoline models, just applies to EVs. So again, you can, if you stretch out your model lineup, throw in some gasoline models and hybrids, A, you're going to sell more, B, they're not going to be subject to tariffs, which might not have happened had the European Union not decided to impose tariffs on EVs in the first place, because the Chinese just went, okay, well, we'll sell something else.
Well, and which brings us back to the point of at the very beginning, which is that if a market or if regulations change and you have a super fast product development cycle, you can respond to that and and I think I'm going to do these numbers from memory, but have models that are, under 2 years old in the marketplace. So everybody in the legacy world is selling models that are 5 years old and have digital technology that's even older than that, right? Because that was all developed prior to the physical car. So, Nick, we're going to, for the benefit of our listeners and viewers, and thank you. I'm going to do two things. One, we're going to head to the finish line here. First, let me ask you. So, you did your story that you did with Nori, and did take a look a little bit at how some of the incumbent brands like VW are responding to this. Talk about that a little bit. If you have a take on kind of how that's going, whether they're catching up fast or whether they're still kind of, hacking through the jungle to try to get to where the Chinese are.
Well, I think you've seen with Volkswagen has bought into XPeng, and they're working with both XPeng and FAW to develop fast in China for China. Renault, which doesn't sell cars in China, now has an R&D center in Shanghai, and their aim is to develop the new electric Twingo by next year, and it's under 2 years. And I think that's the way that the legacy car makers are going and have to go if they want to compete. Is, if you can't beat the Chinese at their own game, join them one way or another.
Do a joint venture.
Yeah. And license the technology, but also change the mindset, because this is one of the aspects of the story and one of the things that I found astounding about the Chinese is how responsive they are to customer needs or complaints. So Zeekr developed a new navigation system for Europe in its car based on input from Zeekr owners in Europe, and they developed it in 4 months and rolled it out. If you think about that, that's just, where does that happen? And these are, again, kids who said, well, we're allowed to fail fast. So we screwed up at first, and then we managed to do it quickly. Or there's lots of individual examples of where, Chery with the Emoda 5, they got a customer call in the UK on a Friday saying, I can't see the emergency handbrake light behind the steering wheel. That's a digital light. So the product manager in the UK emails the engineers in Woohoo on a Friday night and says, customer can't see the emergency handbrake light. Can you take a look at this? He comes in on Monday morning. They've sent him a zip file to upload that fixes it. There's now, this is, I think, the big challenge, even bigger than just trying to cut out all of those development processes that have making cars such a lengthy process for legacy car makers, is understanding that Chinese car makers don't just view the sale as the end of the process. Respond. And in China, if you don't, you're dead. It's move fast or die. And so, I think that's that.
I'm going to make 2 comments, Joe, because I'm going to ask for your input on this as well. This is where it's more high tech. You had emphasized that they take a high tech approach to product development, number one. Number two, it's customer focused. We know OEMs to be very product focused. The folks on this call that are still working at the legacy automakers, you go into a meeting, everything's about the F-150, the Tahoe, the vehicle, the actual product. And your point you're making, Nick, is that a customer said something and they changed it because the customer wanted it. That's the customer focus that the OEMs still do not have. But since we're trying to wrap this up, I'm going to post this to both of you who are been following the automotive space and the legacy automakers for quite some time. How do they respond? What do they need to do? Because we're trying to communicate, educate, but what do they need to do to keep up? Do they have a chance? Are there OEMs that might be better suited or less suited? We talk about partnerships, but what else can they do?
Nick, why don't you go first, and I'll weigh in after.
I think they have to unlearn a lot of what has been standard procedure and it's hard over a century. Everyone has got a role that they've been used to playing, and I think the Chinese, it's like sort of going from not having a phone to having a cell phone, never having had a landline. I think the Chinese just approach everything differently. And as I say, if you don't grow up in or spend decades in an OEM or join an OEM that's been doing it for a long time, you get to invent how the process is made. And maybe there are ways of doing it even quicker than the Chinese that no one has yet discovered. But I think unlearning everything, treating the car like a cell phone on wheels, and treating consumers as partners beyond just the point of sale, which is, I think, is going to be a very difficult thing for legacy automakers to learn. But I think it's going to be fundamental because, as I say, the Chinese have shown that they do, if customers want something, they're happy to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I look at this, what's happening with the Chinese and the encounter that the legacy automakers and including Toyota and the Japanese automakers are having right now as kind of a repeat of the collision between Toyota in the 1970s and 1980s and the Detroit car companies who were then the dominant automakers in the world, along with VW. I mean, it's that, but it's that squared. Because it's not just a matter of like, well, Toyota had a more efficient production system in the factory, and as well as a more efficient engineering system, but it was mainly factory focused. And as Nick, as you've outlined, and too has outlined, this is beyond that, right? And it's off a base of a huge economy, China, and a government that is absolutely 100% willing to do whatever it takes to make their auto industry and their national champions dominant. But it is, I think, if you're at a Western automaker, a Detroit automaker, VW, this is a 5-alarm fire, because this is the encounter with the Toyota production system in the 1980s on steroids. I do think that, and just today there was a story in Reuters that reinforces what I'm about to say. The idea is, especially in the United States and also in Europe, that we can buy time with tariffs. We can keep them out, keep the Chinese out, or keep the Chinese at a relatively small market share, and buy time to kind of get up to speed with the cost and the all of the things, Nick, that you've been talking about, all those the applications with technology. Just today, there's a story in Reuters about how the Japanese automakers, Toyota, Honda, Nissan, are refocusing on America. It's America first. Why? Because they look at China and they say, okay, forget about it. That's a killing field. There's no way we're going to be able to succeed and make a lot of money in China. The Chinese are coming into Southeast Asia, also a Japanese market. Well, that's bad. They're coming into Latin America. Where else can we go? Well, the Japanese will refocus on gaining market share in the United States. So in a way, that's an indirect impact of the Chinese automakers' success and their rise on the quote-unquote protected American market. So I just think there's nowhere to hide if you're Ford, if you're GM, if you're Volkswagen. I mean, look at Renault, big profit warning today. If you're one of these legacy automakers, it's 5-alarm fire, and they've got to figure out how to achieve the cost and the speed that you've described in this piece, or else they risk being really consigned to kind of very regional and much smaller roles in the industry, kind of wards of the state, if you will. I mean, maybe that's a little alarmist. We'll see. Maybe 5 years from now, I'll be shown to be completely wrong about that. But I do think that's where we're at. And in your piece, the piece you did with Nori, I urge everyone to go find it on Reuters.com.
Great piece. Great piece,
yeah,
Nick. I'm glad you guys
search
were
for
able to...
Tesla in the dust, because we haven't mentioned Tesla so much. But honestly, and maybe this is a whole different stream, but I'll just say Tesla comes off as a legacy automaker in your story. I know they're not really. I know they have a special place, and they know a lot of the things that the Chinese automakers are doing. They taught the Chinese automakers a lot of the things that they're doing. But I do believe that they're at some risk of being GM to BYD's Toyota. So
there was news this morning of Tesla launching two new trims. They're not new vehicles, they're new trims for the 3 and the Y. It's not going to really help them.
I thought it was a six passenger, Model Y L, right?
Yeah.
Which, to be uncharitable, that's an idea that they should have had from the get-go, and that the German companies figured out that that's what you need to have in the Chinese market. An L version of your standard car. They figured that out well over a decade ago, right? So,
almost 20 years ago.
20 years ago, yeah.
In order to attract or accommodate the China market 20 years ago, they effectively added almost a meter to the current A4s, E-classes. Didn't really test them. They just added a meter. And, after years and years of selling the L versions, it became part of their product portfolio. But that was where they just Band-Aided or Frankenstein together a product that was going to sell a ton in China. So, yeah, Nick, great article. That's why I wanted to put this together, because it was very objective. You having not been to China in a while, and then kind of talking nuts and bolts as opposed to being very opinionated, because there's a lot of data in there that you can point back to and say it's very objective. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
And
See
hold
you
on.
again.
So I know there's a question from Kevin Gilbo. He lives in Detroit, so I can circle back with him. But one of the things that I'm thinking about, Joe, that I'm telling you for the first time is there's a couple of design folks that are also on Substack that we can invite to talk about interior design, exterior design, and how that's evolving because of China. So you raised a great point. Whether they're in the market or not, they influence and affect the global market. And so one of the aspects we'll talk about hopefully in the near future is on the design side, Kevin. So everyone, thanks again for joining us. We'll get better at this from a marketing standpoint and everything. But Nick, you're the man. That place looks awesome. Next
Thank you.
time I'm in London, you got to invite me over so we can have a few pints, man.
I'll smoke you a brisket. How about that?
Okay, nice, dude.
That's great. Cultural exchange.
There you go.
Thanks, everyone. See you again soon.